Hey everyone, I'm Liz Fairy, and today I'm going to finally finish my Crochet Yoshi doll. This video is part 3 of this series. You can find part 1, as well as the written pattern on Ravelry, in the description below. So now I'll just continue where I left off and begin creating Yoshi's eyes. There's probably a lot of ways you could do this, but I'm going to make a little ball out of white yarn, and I'll embroider on the eyeball detail afterward with my black and gray yarn. I've started with another magic circle with 6 stitches of single crochet. Now I'll increase for 1 row. I'm done with my row of increase. Next, I'll single crochet for 1 row. Then I'll decrease for 1 row to close up the ball. Slip stitch to the first stitch of the row, cut off a long tail of yarn, and use the tail to sew the eye to the eyelid later. I'll use the other tail to sort of stuff the eye by pushing it in with the end of my hook. Then, using my gray and black yarn, I'll sew the iris and the pupil pattern onto the front of the eye, leaving a small spot of white visible on the pupil for the eye shine. Obviously, you're going to need to do this twice to create 2 eyes. Next, I'll make the eyelids, again using my green yarn. I'll start with a magic circle, but this time I only have 5 single crochet stitches on my circle. I'll be using this to make a half circle this time, rather than a full circle. I'm not going to work in the round this time, so I'll turn the work, and then chain 1 to count as the first stitch of the next row. I'll go ahead and mark that stitch with a bobby pin. Then I'll increase 3 times into each of the middle 3 stitches of the previous row, starting with the 3rd chain from the hook. So single crochet 2 times to increase that stitch. Then increase the next 2 stitches, and single crochet in the last stitch. I'll repeat that pattern for 2 more rows, so chain 1 for the first stitch, then in this row I'll increase every second stitch in between my first and last stitch of the previous row. So single crochet in the 3rd stitch from the hook, then increase the next stitch by single crocheting 2 times into that stitch. Then single crochet in the next stitch just once, and increase the next stitch. Then one more time, single crochet 1 time in the next stitch, and then increase the next stitch. Then single crochet into the last stitch of the row. Now I'll repeat that pattern for 1 more row, this time increasing every 3rd stitch in between my first and last stitch of the previous row. So again, chain 1 for the first stitch, then single crochet once into the 3rd stitch from the hook, and once in the next stitch. Then in the 3rd stitch, increase by single crocheting twice. Then into the next 2 stitches, just single crochet once, then into the 3rd stitch, increase. And then one more time, single crochet just once in the next 2 stitches, then into the 3rd, single crochet twice to increase. Then single crochet into the last stitch of the row. Now the half circle for the eyelids is a good width. Next I'll deepen the eyelids by single crocheting for 3 more rows. At the end of 3 more rows, chain 1 to end the row, then cut off a long tail of yarn, and use the tail to sew the eyelids to the top of the nose. To make this process a little easier, I used some pins. There's a ton of ways that you could attach the eyes and the eyelids to the face, but I'm going to try sewing the eyes together and then sewing the eyelids around the eyes. If you like, here you can shape the eyelids into Yoshi's signature sleepy expression. Then I'll sew the whole thing to the face. It's so close to being done now. So let's make the shell. I've once again started with the magic circle with 6 stitches of single crochet, this time using my red yarn. Then I increased for 1 row until the shell was the correct width. Then I single crocheted for 3 more rows. Alright, I've gotten to the end of 3 rows of single crochet. Now to create a clean line between the red part and the white part of the shell, I'll create a row of slip stitches. I'll end the red part of the shell with a slip stitch to the first stitch of the row, then cut off my yarn and sew in the end. Now I'll switch to my white yarn to create the bottom of the shell. So using the white yarn, I'll pull up a loop around the back loop of one of the red slip stitches that I just made in the previous row, chain 1 for the first stitch, and slip stitch into the remaining back loops of the row. Then I'll repeat that for 2 rows, working into the back loops of the slip stitches I made in the previous row to lengthen the white bottom of the shell. I finished with 2 more rows of slip stitches. Now I'll once again single crochet. This time I'll decrease the row 6 times to close the bottom of the shell. Before I close it up though, I'm going to add a bit of fiber fill to the inside. Then, to decrease 6 times, since I have 12 stitches total in my shell, I'll just decrease every stitch of the row. Now, at the end of my 6 decreases, I'll slip stitch to the first stitch to end the row, cut off a long tail of yarn, and use the tail to sew the shell to the doll's back. I'll wait to do this until I've made all the spikes that go on the back of the head so that I can position them all at the same time. Speaking of the spikes, I'll create them next. These are probably the easiest part of this doll. I started with a magic circle with 6 stitches of single crochet using my carrot orange yarn. Then I single crocheted for 2 more rows. Slip stitch to the first stitch, and cut off a long tail of yarn to use the tail to sew the spikes to the back of the head. I made 3 of these little spikes. They sort of look like gumdrops. Then I positioned them on the back of the head and sewed them down. Now Yoshi is just about done. All we need to do now is make the boots finally. First, I'll make the bottom of the boot, in a similar way to how I made the inner mouthpiece in the last video. Using my yellow yarn, I'll chain 2 for the foundation chain. Then chain 1 more for the first stitch. Into the second chain from the hook, I'll single crochet 2 times to increase the first side of the foundation chain twice, just like I did when I was making the inner mouthpiece in the last video. Into this side of the next foundation chain, I'll single crochet 2 times. Then turn the work, and into the other side of the same chain, I'll single crochet 3 times to increase that stitch twice. Into the other side of the first chain of the foundation chain that I already worked into, I'll single crochet 2 times. Now there are 5 stitches worked into each of my 2 foundation chains, and there's a total of 10 stitches in the row. Into the next row, I'll increase the first 2 stitches, then single crochet 2, then increase 3, and single crochet 2. Then increase the last stitch. Now there are 3 increases at the front of the foot and 3 increases at the back. Now I'll do the same thing that I did when I was making the shell to make a clean line between the yellow bottom of the shoe and the orange top of the shoe with a row of slip stitches. Then I'll slip stitch the first stitch of the row to end the row, cut off the yarn, then I'll bring the tail of yarn to the other side so that it ends up inside the boot. Now using my orange yarn, I'll slip stitch into the back loop of each of the previous row's slip stitches. This is where the technique is a little different from the shell. Next, I'll create a row of single crochets into the back loops of the slip stitch row that I just made. Alright, I finished my first row of single crochet after changing colors. Now I'll single crochet for 4 more rows. Alright, I've gotten to the end of 4 more rows of single crochet. Now, to shape the boot more like a boot, I'll decrease 3 times at the front toe of the boot, and single crochet into the remaining stitches of the row for 2 rows. It doesn't really matter which side you put the toe of the boot on, just as long as it's at one of the tips of the oval. Now I've finished my 2 rows of decrease to narrow the toe of the boot. Next, I'll single crochet for 1 more row to lengthen the boot before I begin to widen the top. Since Yoshi's boots tend to have a folded down look at the top, I'll recreate that by increasing 6 times per row and single crocheting normally into the remaining stitches for 1 row. Then slip stitch to the first stitch to end the row, cut off the yarn, and sew in the end. Then repeat that process to make another boot for the other foot. Then pull the boots onto the feet of the doll. They're a pretty tight fit, so you might need to finesse it a bit to get them on, but at least you won't have to sew them on to secure them to the feet. And now my Yoshi is finally done. If you're interested in the written pattern, you can find a link to my pattern store on Ravelry, where you can find all of my designs in the description below. I also made a baby Yoshi and a Yoshi egg a while back, so the Yoshi family is finally complete. This has been such a long journey to complete this doll, and I just want to take a moment to look at the huge differences between my first Yoshi that I made years ago and the new version. It's so interesting to see how much I've improved over the years. What about you guys? Have you ever remade a project years later to see how much you've learned? Is there a project that's taken you years to finish? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you use any of my techniques to make any part of my Yoshi Amigurumi family, I'd love to see your interpretation. You can find all of my social media links in the description below. If you enjoyed this tutorial, you could press the like button or share it on social media. And if you'd really like to help out the channel, you can donate to my Patreon. You can get some pretty cool perks through Patreon, like seeing my videos early, access to some of my prototype patterns, and discounts in my Ravelry store, depending on your level of donation. You can find out more about that at patreon.com/fairyrings. You could also subscribe and click the bell icon so that you don't miss my next video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!